cult recovery, cult education is so important to stop that. And it even goes down to like the relationship level. I've heard different people say like a narcissistic abusive relationship, that's a one-on-one cult, the way that functions.
What's going on, y'all? Welcome back to the Struggle to Strength podcast, your source for real life application on how to turn your struggles into strengths in all things mind, muscle, and money. This is just a good episode on awareness around really just manipulative strategies and narcissistic tendencies and behavior that was told through the story of someone who survived and removed himself from a cult situation. Yeah. But there's a lot of lessons to be learned outside of that environment as well, which is interesting to me. Definitely. So this was a different but definitely interesting episode. And some valuable, especially at the end, there's some valuable takeaways on how to identify manipulative and narcissistic people and environments. So listen to the end. We've got some, Andrew had some good takeaways for you and some things for you to start researching if you are feeling like you may be in a manipulative or narcissistic environment or a cult. But yeah, I hope you guys enjoy this new episode. We will see y'all inside. Andrew, I'm excited to hear your story because it's very unique. It's very interesting.
I don't think I've ever talked to anyone who's in your situation before.
I see. That's interesting. Okay. Yeah. I'm on Guestio and I was looking for shows and I was like, who would actually like want to like would hear this story? And I saw like Struggle to Strength because it stood out to me because kind of like the message of my story kind of is like, you can become your own hero. Really, I guess, in a sense, because there were a lot of like risky choices I had to make to get out of that situation and had no idea what the outcome exactly would be. And honestly, like I'll talk about it more in the interview, I guess, but like if I would have never made this really like iffy decision that really made me, I got kicked out of the Christian college I was at, and like a smear campaign happened at that college of me, and just excluded from that group, which I was fine with because I made it very clear I didn't want to be a part of that group anymore. But it's like you start over, really. All your connections are gone. And that's the thing, which I'll get into more about cults, is that they keep you so dependent on in the group, like your family's in the group, your friends are in the group, your career connections are in the group. And so to get out of that was so difficult. And in a sense, that's why I tell people I had to become my own hero. Like no one was going to save me from that environment or take me out. I had to do that myself, which is really hard. But it's been really great too, because being able to become an actual individual, which I'll talk about further on in the interview, just all the control they had over your identity in that environment.
Yeah, that's what I think I'm most interested in is like, obviously you grew up, and we know this, and I don't know, to the listeners, Andrew grew up in a Christian cult. What was that like? And when did you start to have the feeling that you didn't want to be a part of it? And how did, like, that must have been
Yeah. So like, just for context, so I was born into this cult. And for people who aren't familiar, it was the IFB, which stands for Independent Fundamental Baptist. And just for a little background of this movement, the IFB was really started as a reaction, especially in like the 1920s. It was as a reaction to modernism. And as science progressed and there was proof that a lot of their fundamentals of Christianity were contradicted by science, certain Christians in the Baptist arena that were more on the fringe or more extreme were like, we have to separate. We can't let our congregation be exposed to science or this information. We have to go into these different churches, isolate them, indoctrinate them, and to continue to grow our churches and then also our influence to get into the government, which nationalism is very much, and specifically Christian nationalism is really a big part of the IFB, because they believe that their way is the only way, and really for salvation, which really means to get to heaven. And kind of for a little bit of background on their beliefs, they love the KJV Bible, which for people who don't know what that is the King James Version. And they see that as the word of God, and any other version is not legitimate. It's influenced by Satan. And if you're a Christian and you're not reading the KJV, then the devil has his influence over you, because that's not the real Bible, or the, in air quotes, the true Bible. So this very extreme, like, we have the truth. This is the only way to live your life. And they're very strict on your lifestyle, and they're very controlling of the environment you're in and the friends you have. So, for example, in that environment, you had to save sex for marriage, and you couldn't even have sexual thoughts, really, period. And there was so much shame about being human, and they tried to control that. Like, I remember being into a Sunday school class in the cult I grew up in, and it was specifically a teen Sunday school class, and the teacher starts passing around a purity pledge for everyone to sign, that you are going to promise that you are not going to have sex until marriage, and that God is watching you signing this. And so, of course, like, this guy is watching everyone, making sure everyone signs this, and I'm like, this is not consent. Like, this is coercion. Like, we're basically being forced to sign this. And, the thing I want to emphasize, if people want to save sex for marriage, that is fine, if that is what you want to do. But in this environment, that's not really a choice or a decision you really get to make. And that's the thing. They're so controlling of what you do and who you are, what you believe, what you think. And psychology was like of the devil in that environment too. Like, you were not supposed to go to a therapist or a psychologist. You just read the Bible and pray, because in that environment, all mental health issues were like spiritual. And in that environment, they defined spiritual as having like a relationship with Jesus, and that if that relationship was fine, your mental health would be great, because to them, they taught that every person has like this God-shaped hole inside of them that Jesus could only fill. And I did buy into that for a long time, because I did feel empty a lot. But as I've gotten out, I realized that a lot of that emptiness is really from like attachment issues, from trauma, from logging, from abandonment issues, and different things. Like, it's so complex that this religion can never just fix with like saying a prayer or believing soming. And
what about physical health, like cancer? Like, if somebody got cancer, would they be like, pray that away, or would they say to go to the doctor?
Yeah, it's interesting. And it's good, because when it came to physical health, they did want people to see a doctor, most definitely. And like, there would be a list every week of people who were in the hospital who would be praying for. And as I've gotten out, I'm like, okay, so they're okay with you going to the doctor for physical things, but meant, so they clearly didn't see them in the same light. And I think in their minds they tried to justify going to a doctor, that that it's okay, like God gave these people these abilities or whatever, and they can help us, this is God's gift to us to, and to them, everything seen as like wrong in society, or whether it's physical or mental, to them that is a sign of the fall, which in the Genesis, like when Adam sinned and all of mankind was cursed for what Adam did. And so all of mankind was then on their path to hell. And it's interesting because hell is not even in the Old Testament, but that's a whole other issue. But yes,
so it seems like it started out as kind of like a, I guess, normal, like the history of that's kind of interesting. Like, it started out as kind of like a quote unquote normal section of the like religious community, and then like kind of over time became an actual like cult.
Yes, most definitely. And all the IFB churches, the thing is, they're independent, so each one can run or do whatever they want. And so for the specific one that I grew up in, there were red flags that stood out to me. Like, for example, the devotion that people had to the leader of our church. And, he's not alive anymore, but his name was Brother Bobby. And just the devotion that people had to him. Like, I didn't have the language when I was in that group to understand that, but something bothered me by how enamored and obsessed people were. And even my own parents. Like, I think an example of this in that environment was, I remember, a church member getting in the pulpit and praying to God and praying, dear God, help us to be more like Brother Bobby. And in that environment, you're taught to be more like Jesus. So that was like a moment of like cognitive dissonance for me. I'm like, this is contradictory. What is going on? And like, I looked around and everyone is like bowing their heads and nodding. And I was like, is no one really questioning what that person just said? Like, is it like, oh my gosh. And so my internal system was like, this is not right. Something is off. And another red flag to me was every year our church would have this service that was like dedicated really to the history of our church. And it was a service where everyone was given like this, basically a pamphlet at the beginning of the church, and like all the buildings that we had built and all the members that we had and accumulated. And like, this was a big church. Like, it had 2,000 people in this church, and like in the 90s.
Wow.
It was huge. But the thing that was interesting is that as it got to like 2010s, it greatly declined and there was a major exodus. And it's been interesting as I've publicly left that environment and talked about growing up. I've had several people that used to go there and be like, I'm so sorry you were in there your whole life. We got out, as parents telling me, we saw the effect their teachings had on our children. They started hating themselves. They started having a lot of anxiety, getting really depressed and anxious about everything. And even the effect on our own mental health and how controlling they were. And, for example, for some of the rules that they had in that church, like women had to wear dresses and they had to go to the floor, basically. Like, women really couldn't show their bodies, and women could not be in leadership positions either. They were supposed to be quiet, really. And you were not supposed to be friends with people outside that belief system. You were only supposed to witness to them, which really means like sharing the gospel, which in that environment, the gospel is really showing them in the Bible. Really, it's their interpretation of how to get to heaven. And it's like admitting that you're a sinner, believing that Jesus died on the cross for your sins, and confessing your sins. And once you do that, then you have a ticket to heaven, and then you're secured the rest of your life. But the thing is, they will always make you doubt that. They will say things like, if you're really saved, like, you'll love coming to this church, you'll love tithing, you'll love serving. So all these things that benefit this environment, they're like, you'll love doing these things. And looking back, I just laugh at that because it's such a scam, really. Like, like giving your money, giving your time, and giving your resources. And it's really, I think it's really awful because, as human beings, we've always been scared of the unknown of what happens after we die. And there are so many cults that use this fear to really abuse, and control people.
Yeah. So really, this is this is a story of like master manipulation, almost, using the fear of death to control people. Did it seem like, or does it seem like the majority of the people who would find themselves entering into that kind of environment, like, was fear of death the main, attracting factor?
Yeah, I think that was the attracting factor. And the thing about fundamentalist Christianity is that it gives your life so much structure in it. It provides you a sense of certainty. So I think the people who are attracted to groups. As human beings, I think we don't like uncertainty, but I think there are people who are stronger towards that fear of uncertainty. And so I think, I'm trying to remember, in social psychology, I think uncertainty avoidance, the higher you are in that, the more you structure your life to avoid any kind of uncertainty whatsoever. So this group gave you comfort. It gave you security. It gave you purpose. I remember being told, like, God put you in this group to spread this message, to save the world. We have to save the world. We have to get, our men into the government and, put these Old Testament and different laws into our government, because this is what God wants. This is the only way. And our country will be what it needs to be if we get this ideology into the government. So for people to be told that they are chosen, that they are special, that God has a plan for them, that they care for them, like, that's so powerful.
Yeah.
So powerful.
Yeah. And it seems like they're just preying on, everybody, we all know we're going to die. People are afraid of how they're going to die and what's going to happen after they die. So it seems like this is a way to create a little bit more structure and a little bit more certainty around what does happen after you die, which, like you said, brings people comfort. Which I'm sure for a lot of people is hard to, like, comfort is one of the hardest addictions to break. Yes. Every addiction is based on the foundation of comfort. So for you to move out of this structured lifestyle, you knew that you didn't want to be a part of it. Yeah. You were taking a huge risk, and everybody probably thought you were, like, completely insane for doing so. Everyone in your circle. Yeah. I'm sure you got mixed signals from, like, the people that were in that community who were shaming you, like you said, and then other people who were like, dude, you're doing the right thing. What was that process like? What was the risk that you took? I know you were expelled from your university, but, like, you still had to do things on your own to get to where you are now.
Yeah. So I think I'll kind of go through my process of the questioning, because that's what a lot of people have said to me. They're like, you got out of this by the time you turned 22 years old. Like, what in the world? Like, how did you get to that point to question? And I think it really was, for me, my own internal experiences not matching what the group taught. So, in that environment, I struggled with my own sexuality and being like, I don't meet this, this heteronormative standard they're talking about. And then again, I'm like, they talk about gay people, but their definition is really extreme. And I don't think I really meet that either. So it's like, I don't know what, like, I don't fit into their binary. So where do I fit? And that's the thing about cults, is that they're very black and white. There's no gray in between. And
the world is gray.
It is.
The world is where we live in gray spaces. We live in the space between.
Even the cult itself, like, is gray too, because, like, it seems what you're saying, there are some, like, positive elements of it, like, or at least seemingly positive, and that's probably what keeps a lot of people there. But it's like, if you can, like, that sounds great to eliminate the fear of, like, dying. You know what I mean? So there's clearly even from the outside perspective here, there's even gray areas within that.
Yeah. It's very true. And, like, that's the thing about cults, is that from the outside looking in, they look really nice. Most definitely. They're very, like, otherwise people wouldn't go into them.
Right.
And no one, I want to make it clear, no one looks at a social group and says, oh, that's a cult, I want to join a cult, let's do that. No one does that.
Especially when it's called a cult.
Yeah.
They don't call themselves that, right?
Oh, no. Cults,
no. Yeah.
Cults never call themselves cults. And
right. That's how you know it's a cult.
And you will definitely have members come at you and say, it's not a cult, blah, 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 and all of this. And sorry, I'm trying to remember what your question is, because I don't want to get off track.
Oh, no, you're good. I was wondering what the risks that you took to leave that environment were like. And what did you face there?
Yeah. So my own sexuality not matching that. So then I'm like, okay, well, they're telling me this is the truth, but my experience is not matching that. Something is off there. So that really started me to question it. And then the red flags about the obsession and devotion to my pastor and like even my own parents, like I was really ashamed by my parents for not looking up to this person. I really did question like, why do y'all look up to him so much? Like they would literally like cry when they would start talking about him. And I was like, oh, okay. And it was just insane to me. And it bothered them that I didn't have that same experience or feeling about him. And when people left that cult, a red flag to me also was my parents saying, oh, they're not devoted or to Brother Bobby. Like, oh, like, we're gonna stick by his side. And I'm like, and like, okay, like that's looking back, I'm like, that's really culty.
Yeah.
And as I went on and on, it was really too, my mental health was terrible, like awful depression. Like, I think it was like, and in my college years, I already suffered like 4 depressive episodes. And I learned to try to hide that depression because I was always shamed and blamed for it. And it's frustrating because it's really insanity because they tell you to do these things and it doesn't work. So you're doing these things over and over and nothing works. Praying, reading the Bible, there's a lot of blame and shame, like, oh, you're not close to God enough, or oh, you've sinned and you're separated from God. You need to confess, or oh, like we have to change your sexuality and then you'll be restored to God, and then everything will be fine. And so for me, I had to be like, this is not working. I've been through all these oppressive episodes. My mind is clearly is telling me something is not all right here. And these things aren't working. But, in that environment, I wasn't exposed to psychology or educated on mental health, or in my own home life, we never talked about emotions. We weren't allowed to have opinions. I mean, we weren't allowed to express our individuality, or that, that we had that. So it was a very extreme patriarchal kind of home environment that religion really influenced. And so it was in my college years that and for people who want to know, I went to Bob Jones University, which is a fundamentalist Christian college in Greenville, South Carolina. And I really didn't want to go to a Christian college at all. By the time I was 17, I knew I wanted to at least leave fundamentalist Christianity. But my parents were so controlling because, also, I don't know if I mentioned this, I was homeschooled my entire life. So I was homeschooled for the purpose of indoctrination. And I was subjected to school curriculums that had a fundamentalist Christian agenda. And so the purpose was to keep me and my 2 other brothers in this group. So when I got to college and I already kind of knew, like, I didn't have the language or really the deep understanding yet, but I'm like, this is a toxic environment. And I kept telling myself, I'm like, just get through these 4 years of college and you can leave all of this behind. And I ended up not getting through all those 4 years. I got expelled, and I'll dig into a little bit why. But questioning that environment while in it is really difficult because you can't tell anyone. And so for me, what really the big questioning was my mental health. And when I started researching secretly, which is sad, secretly researching about mental health and trauma and depression, I found the term religious trauma. And to me, like the concept that religion or toxic religion could cause trauma individual was really like, again, that cognitive dissonance. I was like, no, like this is supposed to be the answer. This is what they told me, that like this shouldn't have caused trauma. But once I read more about religious trauma and the symptoms, I started to understand that, oh my gosh, like all of these struggles with like anxiety and depression, and then also understanding that I had really complex PTSD, and understanding, oh, like this is from all these years of conditioning, of these toxic messages, and my human development being stifled throughout all of my life. And that was really hard to deal with, realizing that your entire life and everything you'd always been told that was right caused trauma, and it's something that will affect you the rest of your life. And I'm like, and to me, that was really scary. That was overwhelming. And I'm like, I don't want to deal with this. I don't know what to do.
Well, it seems like it takes like a massive amount of self-awareness to even like start going down that road.
Yes.
Were your parents born into that too, or did they join?
Yeah, it's interesting. Both of my parents, well, I know my dad was born into it. My mom grew up Methodist for a little bit, but then her parents, they were really recruited into the IFB cults, and like my maternal grandmother just like, oh wow, she just really got into it so much, heavily involved, and it's just an extremely religious person. And she passed that down to my mom, and my mom passed that down really to me. And that was an interesting thing, was that my mom was really the big influence of religion in our home life. My dad didn't really talk about religion, and he was a pastor for a few years before I was born. Like, he went to college for pastoral ministry. He, 4 years of studying that, he became a pastor and realized it wasn't for him at all. But he never taught, which is interesting to me, how, she was just really in that home, that environment, the spiritual leader. And he was just really kind of like the breadwinner and the background, really. But yeah, so my dad was born into it. My mom was eventually, like, her parents got into it, and then they passed it down to us with homeschooling and then kind of being in that environment.
Did you know anyone at all outside of this cult, like throughout, your experience there?
It's interesting. Yeah. The one person that I knew outside of this cult was actually a neighbor next door. And it was interesting because I think, the parents in that household, our neighbors, they definitely thought our family was strange, which we definitely were. And they tried to question my mom, be like, oh, like, are you gonna, when your children are in high school, are you gonna, let them go to public school and socialize and different things? And my mom would get very defensive when people would question her about homeschooling. And really, for socialization, it was in the cult, and it was in a homeschool and different homeschool groups and 4-H clubs that were still heavily influenced by Christianity. So my parents heavily controlled. So I was around Christians all the time.
Yeah. You didn't really have much of a, like,
no other perspective.
No other perspective, or no other like pathway of getting out either, right?
No.
Do you feel like you kind of had to like trailblaze your own experience out of there?
Yeah. And so, yeah, you're right. Like, I wasn't exposed to any different perspectives. And it's just, you feel so trapped because you're suffering in silence, and like, you're like, I don't know, like, I want to get out and I don't know how to get out. And, for me, I guess in my, at that age at 17, when I decided that I want to leave this environment, I'm like, I have to meet people on the outside. So while I was at Bob Jones University, I really lived a double life. And I started connecting with people outside of Bob Jones University in the local community. And how I did this was, attending church was a requirement at Bob Jones University. And so I learned to go to more progressive churches, which I wasn't even allowed to go to because Bob Jones has a list of churches that you can go to that you had to choose from, and you couldn't really go outside that list. So again, like, that high control in that environment, like, I had to learn to be a rule breaker, which is really hard for me because I was always such a perfectionist and a people pleaser, always following the rules, staying in line. And learning to do that was really hard. And it's really sad that it happened, but I had to get to the point of suicide, basically, to make that decision to even explore outside that environment, because here I was suffering in silence, with all this trauma from my life, and also hiding my sexuality. And like you know, when you're in an environment and you can express yourself and you can't seek help, like you're surrounded by so many people, but you feel so alone. And I knew if I expressed doubts to people that I wasn't going to be safe, because in that environment, the ideology is more important than the person. And this is another sign of a cult, is when it doesn't matter what you've gone through or what you're going through, sticking to the rules or to the group's rules is always most important. And so they'll always try to interpret your experience through their ideology instead of trying to understand the complexity of the situation and understand where you're coming from. So once I realized, I'm like, okay, I have to seek help outside this environment. So when I explored different churches, that's where I connected with people that really, the kind of churches I went to, they're the exact opposite of what I grew up in. They were not high control. They weren't hateful. They weren't fear-based. They didn't constantly talk about hell and fire and brimstone and talk about the rapture and the end times and, you know, all this fear-based. It was very loving and very kind. And it was good for me to experience. And I connected with a family in a local church, and I told them about my situation, and I was like, I don't know what to do. I'm like, I need a true community, you know, where I can, you know, express, you know, what I'm going through, what I'm feeling, and and really begin to individuate too, and really become a human being. And they were like, okay, like they live right by Bob Jones University. They're like, we'll take you to church every week, and because we're going anyway, we'll support you. And so once they got to know me, they then began to invite me over to their house for dinners and got to know me more. And it was just such a relief and such a contrast to have an environment where you can actually be yourself, and you don't have to be hyper vigilant, and you don't have to hide things, and you don't have to pretend to be something that you're not. And so through those years at Bob Jones, and I really began to really dig more into that religious trauma, really through art, because that was my major at that school. I was a visual studies or visual arts major. And so I used that. I'm like, okay, like, I don't know how to intellectually get into this yet, but let me express this through art because I have to get this out. So it ended up being, so I was at Bob Jones from 2018 till 2021. So in 2021, that was when I started making a photo art series on religious trauma. And this was my senior year. And it was like, kind of like, I guess you would say, my capstone kind of project of just showing all the skills I had built all those years. And I was like, I want this project to be so personal and so healing. And it really showed my internal journey of a person that's stuck in a religious environment. And then they're like, you know, the series is of a person, they're like locked in a room. And in the end, they finally escape this room. And that kind of, you know, for me was like my expression of leaving this environment. And so before I made it public, I was like, okay, like this is going to change everything. I know there's going to be a lot of backlash. So, but I wanted to promote the project. So in Christianity, this person, he was very influential. His name is Josh Harris, and he wrote the book, I Kissed Dating Goodbye. And it heavily influenced purity culture, or these very strict standards of like dating or being romantic with someone. So he was a big figure in influencing like purity culture and like saving sex for marriage and like not, you know, touching people of the opposite sex. So in his book, it's funny because he published this book about love and relationships at 21 years old. And yes, 21 years old. Huh? Yeah.
Yeah.
And it sold, I think it sold 1 million copies worldwide now. And just evangelicals and fundamentalist Christians loved it. But when he publicly deconverted from that environment, that made big waves. And he eventually like used his influence online to talk about his deconstruction journey and why he left that environment. And he apologized for all the harm that he caused through that ideology. And that was just mind blowing to me. And so I reached out to him late 2021 because he kind of did like an IGTV when IGTV was a thing, but did really an IG live show. And I was like, I would really love to like be on your platform and share my story and talk about this photo series. And I never thought he would get back to me. Honestly, I thought I'd just give it a shot. And once he got back to me, it's like, I'd love to have you on. I was like, oh crap. I had all these mixed feelings about it. I'm like, this is great. But then again, like all the risk that's involved, like, you know, being in this on his show and telling my story, but I did it. And I was expelled from Bob Jim's university because of that interview.
That's what got you expelled.
Yes. Yeah. And because of things I said in it about really leaving that environment and opening up about that environment's impact on my sexuality and how much trauma it had caused. And so, yeah, I was kicked out.
So it seems like the internet, social media, modern technology, whatever you want to call it, was actually like a big part of this for you because you didn't know anyone personally, but you had access to the internet.
Yeah, and that's
really interesting
thing. Yeah, and the thing for me, I did not have access to the internet until I was 17. Actually,
and that's when it all changed.
When it all changed.
Yeah. You were like, oh, here's what the world is really like.
Dude, that is such an interesting point though, because think about like previous generations and stuff and like the manipulation that different whether it's the Germans in the 40s, it's like, you know what I mean? Like, or cults or whatever. It's like the manipulation that they were able to have just with like propaganda and stuff, and no one could fact check it.
That's true.
And now when you have access to Twitter and the internet and all these places, which are, you know, obnoxious in their own way, but they do, like, I think this is a really powerful thing that they bring to the table, which is like access to information. You can be like, actually, I just read like 50 things that say what you're saying is wrong. And this is clearly, you know what I mean?
Yeah. And that's the thing in that environment. Information control is a big part of cults. They do not want you to have access, and they'll tell you that, oh yeah, any information that contradicts what we believe, that's of Satan and you need to stay away from this. They make you scared of it. They don't want you to go near it. And for me, I was like, you know, if what they're saying is actually like it's the truth, then there shouldn't be an issue with contradictory information. So that shouldn't be an issue.
When you were breaking out then, and when you were going off on your own, you went from like a super rigid structure to now seeing the world in like a completely new way. A lot of people would struggle with that because like freedom is great, but it can also be like really overwhelming. It can be stressful as hell. You're like, I can do whatever I want. Like,
then what do I do?
What do I do then?
And that's interesting what you're talking about because, and I think what helped me was I got to know at least begin to get to know who I was as a person before I left. Because if people do not begin to do that inner work before they leave a cult, that cult has your identity, and you leave and you're like, I'm nothing without this group because they gave you your identity. Like they told you who to be, what to think, and who to be with. And now that's gone. And I've never thought about what so I think because I at least started that journey of understanding that, I had a sense of an idea of who I was and who I wanted to become.
Do you think that your actual, like what was probably really plaguing you for a while, but like, you know, your sexual identity or, you know, that type of thing. Do you think that actually helped in a way where you were like, I know this is not me at all. I feel something pulling me here. I can go find this thing versus maybe someone who was just like a straight male, for instance. They're like, well, I don't really have anything else pulling me in another direction. Like, this is, you know what I'm saying? Like,
and that's the thing. I've had people say to me, they're like, Andrew, like, you know, your sexual identity saved you out of that environment, really. And I was like, wow, like, you're really right. Because that's really what made me question. And I think that kind of too brings in the idea of like, not everyone has the same experiences in cults. And that's the thing. It was hard for some people to realize, yes, there are a lot of cults that harm people, but there are some people that they don't feel that at least. And then again, they might leave and then they might realize like, oh, like this actually might have really affected like my critical thinking skills or my being able to think for myself. But it kind of gets into the area of like intersectionality of like how being in a certain environment and how that identity interacts kind of back and forth in a way, I guess you would say.
Yeah.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. That's interesting. Dude, you've got a phenomenal story, man.
Thank you.
Of breaking out of a really hard situation and turning it into a really positive way for you to live your life. I guess as a way to kind of wrap things up, I'm curious to hear, other people who might be in this situation, some things that you might want to say to them, or things that you think would be beneficial for them to hear.
Yeah. I mean, I am so grateful that like I got out of it when I did. And when I did leave, I kind of felt this guilt of like, oh my gosh, there's so many people that are still stuck in this environment, and I was able to find the resources that I needed. And a lot of things really worked out so perfectly at times. And I'm like, feeling bad that did. And, part of really escaping for me, at least, has been trying to really through like social media, give people the information they need and the ability to even question. And so advice for people stuck in those environments, that, it is okay to question. And I would say be careful about expressing that openly, because that could really, I think, cause a lot of harm to you in that environment. People attacking you, or you, being on someone's radar, and it kind of hurts you. So, it's okay to question, and finding that community online, because I think, and I've met so many different other cult survivors online, and we're like, the internet has been our lifeline, being able to find that community, to find someone who's been through that, who understands that. Because that's the thing, when you leave that environment, is as just human beings in general, we need that social interaction. It's built into our biology. We need that. So I think, before you leave, because every situation is different, like I can't give a black and white like prescription to how to do it, but start finding those resources, while you're in that group. And I think one of the things that has helped me so much too, which I guess I didn't mention, was that cult education has really helped me so much. Because what happens is a lot of people, they leave these high control groups and they don't understand the psychology of it, or understand how they were manipulated, or how cults work and how they manipulate and get recruited. So they'll leave a cult and they'll accidentally get sucked into another one.
Yeah.
And
point. Yeah.
So, and that's what I've seen a lot. And like, I almost got sucked into a cult, like an online cult, while I was trying to leave that environment. I knew the red flags to even be like, oh, okay, like I understand the dynamics of this. And so for people who want to dig into cult education, there is Stephen Hassan's BITE model that is used to analyze a cult. It stands for behavior control, information control, thought control, and emotional control. And I don't have time to get into it because I know we have to end soon, but just look up Stephen Hassan BITE model, and he will guide you through all these different areas of how a cult controls you. And also like Lifton's criteria for thought reform. I think that was the original method used to analyze a cult. And those have been so helpful for me, because when you dig into cult education, it applies to every social group that you're in. Once you have that information, you will see signs. And like, for example, you might go to a yoga studio and be like, oh, like this might be kind of culty because I see this sign, or, oh, like I'm going to this book club and it seems to be something that it's really not. It's a cover for something else. Or, oh, this college group is really, is something else. So
politics have gotten super culty,
yes,
I feel like.
Yes,
in recent years.
Yes, so much. And so for me, as I've dug into cult information, it's just blowing my mind how I'm seeing all these different behaviors and different social groups. and I'm understanding. I'm like, oh my gosh. And that's protecting me from further getting sucked into that. So for people, like, cult recovery, cult education is so important to stop that. And it even goes down to like the relationship level. Like, you know, I've heard different people say like a narcissistic abusive relationship, that's a one-on-one cult, the way that functions. So it's crazy how it can relate to things, but
even like within your own mind too, like getting stuck in certain behavioral patterns.
Yes, like the black and white
lifestyles.
Thinking. Yeah, so much. So it's such a complex and hard thing to deal with. So what I say to people too is like, give yourself time. Don't rush the healing process. And I highly encourage people to go to therapy if that's accessible for them. And if not, like, exposing yourself to like general psychology and trauma information. And like for me, like when I left Bob Jones University, like the next week I went to a therapist because I'm like, it's time. Like I can't do this. I'm not going to do this alone. Like I don't have to anymore. And it is crazy to me how it's almost been a year, since I've been in therapy, and like I'm proud of the progress I've made. And I know there's still so much more to make in that, but I encourage people that it is okay to ask for help.
Yeah, we're big shout out to therapy from this podcast.
Yes.
Sure. But I love this though. I mean, because like you said, this is about more than just ways to build awareness around identifying cult behavior, but it's also just manipulative and narcissistic people and environments in general. Like this is a good way to be able to identify whether you're in a situation that you might be controlled over. So that was a really helpful way to kind of end things here. And your story has been phenomenal, really inspiring, the way that you've made such great progress on your own, and now you're helping others. So Andrew, I can't thank you enough, man, for sharing this and being vulnerable with us.
Yes. Thank you again for having me on. I've enjoyed this.
Of course. And thank you to the listeners who have tuned in to another episode of the Struggle to Strength podcast. We will see y'all next week.